Good morning, Joan. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure being here. I will start by doing a small presentation on some of the main indicators that we see regarding Croatia. So if you could share my screen and to share the indicators, and I would appreciate. Basically, one of the issues that we have, next slide, please. Next is really the puzzling idea that Croatia's GDP growth is still a bit lower than it should be, and the question is why. Next slide, please. One of the issues that strikes us is regarding the weak productivity. Productivity has been partly affected certainly by the tourism sector, but a general proposition of the Croatian economy has been weaker productivity than it happens in other Central European, Eastern European countries. As you can see, this is OECD countries and Central and Eastern European countries. And Croatia, with the exception of Bulgaria, is the country with the lowest productivity or GDP per hour. Next slide, please. This is also happening in terms of not only in terms of levels, but also in terms of productivity. So usually when you have lower productivity, you should be growing faster in terms of productivity. But this graph shows what has happened in the past few years, and this is not the case. Croatia has been having really sluggish labor productivity growth. So the question is what to do, and this is where the agenda for reform should come. Next slide, please. The COVID crisis has hit Croatia very hard, and it's one of of all the countries that we follow, one of that hit the hardest. But you can also see that the hardest hit countries were the ones that had a very large share of tourism, like Spain, Croatia, Portugal, and Greece. And so it's not a surprise that the COVID crisis has hit Croatia more than other countries. Next slide, please. So as I said, the big issue is that what to do in terms of policy. First thing, clearly, the best economic policy at the moment is vaccination. There's no question about that. The fastest we have vaccination, the fastest will be the recovery. Certainly, we're starting to see in Israel, which is the country that is with the fastest vaccination rollouts. And you can see that, please, my slides. Thank you very much. This is a big issue. We can talk about vaccination nationalism, which I think is self-defeatist, but certainly the total priority should be right now to vaccinate as fast as we can so that we can recover fast. Otherwise, we will not be able to recover fast. Today, we just saw Germany going back to some of the lockdown procedures, partly because we don't have enough people vaccinated yet. Second, we think that it's very important, until the pandemic subsides, it's very important to maintain fiscal support. The fiscal situation is in relatively good shape compared to other EU countries, so we think this is important to maintain the fiscal support for now. But in terms of transitioning to a high growth and post-COVID economy, we think that part of the discussion, as we just heard, has to do with what type of investments. We can talk about this in the Q&A if you want. But we also think that more importantly, is to do some reforms. So I'm going to focus on this, on product market reforms and other reforms that Croatia needs, but certainly also other reforms I think could be used, could be seized the opportunity in terms of the recovery, is reducing state ownership, in particular some sectors that are disproportionately still owned by the public sector. So, we have legacy of the past, and many Central Eastern European countries, we have a participation of the state that is higher than most of the other Western European countries. But still, when we have about 1,000 SOEs still on board, and particularly SOEs in areas like tourism, not only brings risks, because obviously this with COVID, we might have some contingent liabilities there, but more importantly, for productivity, we think this is an area where reform should happen. And also reduces barriers to entry and competition in many sectors, especially in service sectors, and improving the investment climate. Please, next slide. Next slide talks about the overall product market regulation. So this is an OECD indicator that covers more than 60 countries and tries to understand whether the restrictions are high or low. And you can see that Croatia basically is on the average of the OECD. Please, next slide. But significant areas for reform, these two at least. You look at the World Bank doing business, and starting a business in Croatia is still a nightmare, and this is not justifiable. We just heard, I think, was the Deputy Prime Minister saying that the priority would be a single office to start the business and to help enterprise as well. I think this is an area certainly. Company registration and licensing, especially registration, is still a nightmare or too complicated in Croatia. It's an area for improvement. The other one is dealing with construction permits. Being in 150th position in the World Bank's doing business shows that something is fundamentally wrong. And so this is an area, in my view, that should be a total priority going forward in terms of reform. Please, next slide. As I said, SOEs play a disproportional role compared to other countries. With the exception of Lithuania, of all the Central and Eastern European countries, Croatia is by far where you have the largest presence of the state. And so this could be a good opportunity for reform during the recovery. If you want to attract and diversify the Croatian economy, a good area to start is to try to identify sectors in which there could be more concessions, then there could be certainly more higher participation for the private sector there, which will bring a lot of investment to the country and create a lot of jobs. So we think this is certainly an area of priority going forward. Next slide, please. Also, regulations in some service sectors. We're talking about here lawyers, notaries, and other type of sectors. We see that some of these regulations the entry are way too strict. So you can see that Croatia for these sectors, retail medicines and lawyers and notaries, scores the worst of all countries we follow. And so this means that competition is highly restricted and regulation is highly restricted. And so an area for reform certainly would be this one going forward to bring more investment. Next slide, please. And another area that needs to recover and needs to improve is certainly the area of the anti-corruption, and pro-integrity agenda. This is very important, knowing that with the recovery plan, there'll be a lot of new EU funds. And so in order to continue to improve public trust, and especially to improve the effectiveness of all these investments, we think that is an area of concern, and top priority should be exactly to strengthen the institutional framework in the fight against corruption and to promote integrity, so that you don't have problems like other European countries have had with the EU funds related to corruption, and so that you don't waste precious resources at the stage when you badly need them for the recovery. I'll stop for now, and then we can talk about other issues.